particular, remember the death and the resurrection of the Lord Jesus Christ, an event which we believe happened 2,000 years ago near Jerusalem. And it's celebrated in a lot of different ways. There's a wide variety of traditions associated with Easter. This is just a few of the ones that I saw. We could have some questions. I'll ask an obvious question so you can get a prize. There's a whole lot of processions that occur. So the boats there is actually happening in Nicaragua. They sort of do a boat procession with a statue of Mary. Pretty interesting. The Day of the Dead, Spanish celebration, but it's found throughout the world, and that happens in the lead up to the Easter long weekend. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. Has anyone actually been to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem? Really interesting site. There is actually solid archaeological evidence. Sorry, someone said yes. Oh, that was a seriously impressive catch. Wow. Oh, it's enthusiasm, motivation, and bam. Yeah, there is actually evidence, reasonably good evidence for part of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre being built on a first century tomb which was outside the walls of Jerusalem at the time. Doesn't mean it's the actual place. Fun story, there's a flat bed of rock there that you can put things on to get blessed. I put my iPhone on there and it didn't change the lifespan of the battery at all. It's very unfortunate. Decorated eggs. So you can see one of the pictures there is eggs that are hung from trees in Germany. And in the top right on your side, guess where that picture's taken from? It is an Easter celebration. Guess where? Australia? No?
The US.
The US. Well done, John. Okay. I'm not a good throw, so this should work well. Terrible. Let me try again. Oh no, it's managed. It's rolled. Yeah, it's actually in the US. It's in Los Angeles. There's a blessing of the animals that dates back to the 1930s. You can take your dog, your cat, your pet snake, your bunny, I guess, probably would work. And they can, yeah, only in America, right? Okay, but there are things, and you see them every year on Facebook, the font of all misinformation, and elsewhere you'll see around this time of year, people putting out memes and comments saying that Easter has got, pagan origins. And this sort of thing tends to get put out by ultra-conservative Christians. And curiously, it also gets put out a lot by a lot of New Age, neo-pagan, earth goddess, spiritual crystal types as well. They actually put out the same material, which is kind of interesting. And it has a reasonably long history. There was a book which some of you may have read. Has anyone heard of Alexander Hislop's Two Babylons? Yes, who's read it? Who's still got a copy? Okay, a couple of people. Yep. I got a copy. I think I was blessed with that as a result of Sunday school, paying too much attention or something. It was super popular when it first came out and remains popular in some Protestant circles today. Unfortunately, most of it should actually be filed in the fiction section. But anyway, so be it. Let's deal with a couple of the myths. Ishtar, Babylonian goddess, Istra, an Anglo-Saxon spring goddess, and bunnies and eggs as fertility symbols. So we're not going to deal with all the fun, just a few little bits and pieces. Ishtar. So Ishtar was the chief female goddess in Mesopotamia. She was, as I've set up on the slide, she was a real piece of work. You didn't want to get on her bad side. It was nearly as dangerous as getting on her good side. Everyone suffered when she was around. She was associated with fertility. She was also associated with war. In fact, she was associated with date palms, wool, meat, and grain, and also kingship. So she had a fairly wide remit of stuff, not bunnies and not eggs. There's a suggestion that she might be mentioned, and it's uncertain, but it's possible that there might be a reference to her in Jeremiah, a couple of places. Jeremiah 7:18 is one, Jeremiah 40 is another, where it talks about the women baking cakes to the Queen of Heaven, and the suspicion, we can't prove it, the suspicion is that was probably related to the worship of Ishtar or Anna, that was more her derivation in that region. So, a bit of an enigmatic figure. We're not 100% sure of that. But there's lots of holes in associating her with Easter. Like, for a start, her name sounds nothing like Passover, which is what everybody calls Easter outside of English-speaking languages. And she's got nothing to do with rabbits, eggs, or, quite importantly, with Jesus. And because the reference to baking cakes is so enigmatic, I think we can probably keep going with hot cross buns. Don't worry about it. Where does Easter actually come from? Well, Easter phonetically sounds a lot like the name of an ancient Anglo-Saxon goddess, Estra. And there was a guy called the Venerable Bede in 725 AD. He wrote tons of books, actually. Wrote them all in Latin, so I can't read them because I didn't pay attention in school. One of the books he wrote was called The Reckoning of Time, and in that he records that what we would call April was named after the goddess Istra, and that the pagans used to hold a feast for her every year. We don't know a single thing else. There's literally 2 sentences in this book. That's it. There's no connection with eggs, no connection with rabbits. And you see pictures put up on Facebook, like the one I've got up on screen of, young maiden goddess with, eggs and rabbits and all these other things. Complete work of fiction. There's nothing that ties her to any of those things whatsoever, which is a bit unfortunate. We have 2 sentences in an ancient manuscript that was predominantly focused on trying to calculate when Passover should be held. That was the main purpose of that book. And it's also the reason, or one of the predominant reasons, as to why we refer to things as the year AD, was actually the work by the Venerable Bede. Fun and boring fact that won't impress people at parties. So the name Easter comes from, yes, the name of an old Anglo-Saxon goddess. However, this is an English thing, right? Christianity throughout all of the rest of Europe is referred to by a name which is a derivation of Passover, because that's actually where the timing of the feast came from. Jesus was crucified around Passover, and it was Passover or Pascha or Paish, derivations of that name, which is the name of the festival everywhere else in the world. It's a little bit Anglo-centric to think the association with this ancient goddess perhaps means anything. What about Easter bunnies and those delicious chocolate eggs? Well, eggs featured in, it's true, in religious ceremonies in Persia. They were sacrificed to Roman gods and also found in Egyptian ceremonies. They were dyed all sorts of colours, green, yellow and red, by the Persians on their spring equinox festival. But do we really need to worry about that? I don't think so. It very quickly became clear in the keeping of Passover by Christians that they would dye eggs red. Now, why were eggs such a thing? Well, actually, historically, one of the reasons is because you couldn't eat them during Lent. Because you couldn't eat the eggs during Lent, and you couldn't convince your chickens to stop laying eggs, you had to hard-boil the eggs, which preserved them, until you could actually eat them when Easter finally came round. Consequently, eggs were really associated with the keeping of Passover or keeping of Easter. And rabbits. Does anyone know why rabbits were a thing? How they became associated with Easter eggs? Anyone know? Okay, what's one of the things you do with Easter eggs and small children? A lot of families do it. Hide them. Yeah, go on, there you go. Someone else said that over there. I don't know who that was. I think I actually managed one successful throw. You hide them. And so the earliest sort of records we have talking about Easter eggs actually has parents suggesting to the kids that it was the bunnies that had hidden the eggs out in the garden. It's literally about as meaningful as parents saying the reason you got 50 cents, I think we got 5 cents, but my parents. It's the tooth fairy, right? And there was no more meaning or detail attached to that. The brothers Grimm, who obviously famous for putting a lot of story tales together, they were the first ones who actually tried to connect, the goddess Estra to eggs and the hares, but they were famous for their ability to spin stories, not for their historical accuracy and religious expositions. So, Easter bunnies and Easter eggs, get into it, not a problem. And chocolate eggs, why did they happen? Well, because chocolate was starting to get really cheap in the 1800s, not really cheap, but cheaper, and people actually started to have some disposable income. So, Easter eggs were really the first sort of Walmart commercialisation effect on religious ceremonies. Really got kicked off in America, unsurprisingly. Okay, what about the timing? People do wonder whether there's some connection between the fact that the timing of Passover or Easter is linked to the full moon after the spring equinox, which means it can range from late March to early April. Why is that? Well, because the origin of Easter, Passover, is the Mosaic laws, the Old Testament timing of the Passover festival. And that was a lunar calendar. So it's not about pagan origins, rather it's about the practical reality. The Old Testament used a lunar calendar. So as Christians started to try and keep Passover themselves, they also kept a lunar calendar with this. It caused an awful lot of debate, and this is one of the reasons why we know this was a very early Christian celebration, because no one could agree when Passover or Easter should be kept. There's at least 3 different authors who record the debates about the timing towards the end of the 2nd century, early 3rd century, and finally it was settled, in the Council of Nicaea in 325, where the Western Church decided we're going to have it this particular point, as we do today, and the Eastern Church said, no, we're going to do it our own way. So interestingly, it's the timing which actually demonstrates to us, whilst there's no mention of Easter keeping in the Bible, we know that within about 160 years of Jesus' resurrection, people were having passionate arguments as to when should we keep this exactly, what's the right day. Right, so it sort of gives us indication that actually keep doing something special around Easter was a thing really, really early in the Christian communities. Very widespread practice and a lot of disagreement about it. So that's, I think, fairly good evidence that it's an early Christian tradition. All right, let's move on a tiny bit from that, and let's talk about where some of the facts might be around Easter. However, in keeping with the fact and fiction scheme, there's a very, very popular tourist attraction outside the current walls of Jerusalem, which is the Garden Tomb. Unfortunately, because of the architectural style, pretty confident that's not a tomb that was in use at the time of Christ, because the architectural styling's out by a couple of hundred years. It's a very nice garden, though. Anyway, enough with the pagan stuff. The key question is, did Jesus die on the cross? And was Jesus resurrected? That's the key and most important question that we need to think about when we talk about Easter. And there's a quote up there from Peter Hitchens, really pointing out that it's the most dangerous, the most important idea and question in human history. Because if Jesus genuinely was raised from the dead, everything else changes. Our purpose, our life, meaning, it's all centred in that particular piece. And if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then Christianity is of no importance. And that's what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15. He says, if Christ is not raised, then we're the most miserable people on the planet, because we've got no hope. There's no point. If Jesus wasn't raised, the entire religion is pointless. So the events of the first Easter are absolutely foundational to Christianity. Now, we could spend an awful lot of time, and people write a lot of books on the subject, trying to bring forward evidence for the events of that first Easter. And we're just going to give a basic overview of the information. We're going to have a look at some of the evidence for the death and the resurrection of Jesus. And there's sort of 3 main areas that fits into, in my mind. Firstly, the fact that there is good historical evidence for the existence of Jesus. We can tie many of the key characters to history, and we can get evidence not only from the Gospels, but also from external sources that demonstrate that he was a historical person, and that's well established. I guess the second question, the second thing we face in thinking about the evidence is what happened to Jesus after he was crucified. If history agrees he was crucified, there's a wide amount of disagreement about what happened next. Was he raised or not? What happened to the body? And then the third and final thing we want to briefly talk about is the eyewitness reaction. So how did people respond to the events of that first Passover? All right. That picture that's up on screen there is a painting that's in the Roman catacombs. It's from mid-early 200s. It depicts Jesus as the Good Shepherd. You can kind of see the sheep over the shoulders. And what we've got up on the screen is just a quote from a scholar named Bart Ehrman. Now, Bart is a self-confessed agnostic. He's a New Testament scholar, but he says, no, I don't believe, I'm uncertain. But there's one thing that is very, very clear, and he puts out, and he says, look, the evidence is very clear. Any dispassionate consideration demonstrates the fact that Jesus was a historical person. And as he says, there are a couple of things that are absolutely certain. One, you can demonstrate and prove beyond reasonable doubt Jesus existed and that he was crucified. And there is no serious debate anywhere about those two facts, about those things being historical. Occasionally you'll run into fringe scholars that deny the existence of Jesus ever, but they play in the conspiracy theory end of the market. They're not taken seriously. There's no debate about the existence of Jesus. And history provides good evidence the key political players at the time. Pilate, Caiaphas and Herod were real people that occupied the positions that are described in the Gospels, independently attested and accepted. Didn't actually used to be that way. A few decades ago, there was no evidence, for example, for Herod. That's now been dug up and discovered. What I want to do, though, is look at some of the, contrary witnesses outside of Scripture that underpin the historical existence of Jesus and his crucifixion. So we just want to pick up on three guys. Josephus, he was a Jewish writer. He was very much aligned with the Romans, ultimately. Tacitus, Roman senator, very early historian, wrote a phenomenal amount of material. And Pliny the Younger, who was a governor in the region that now we would call Turkey. And he was writing letters to Emperor Trajan. Now, you can see from the dates as to when they're writing that they're all reasonably close to the events. You know, they're all sort of 60 to 80 years after the first Easter, so they're pretty close in time to the events they're talking about. And none of them are Christians. So they are, I guess you could say, hostile witnesses. They're not endeavouring to push the Christian side of the story. That makes them pretty good witnesses, yeah. So firstly, we've got an Aramaic text by Josephus. Now I think many of us would be familiar with the works of Josephus, and in the Greek versions, there's what's considered to be, let's just say some enthusiastic Christians got onto the text and amended it to say a little bit more than Josephus perhaps did. But when we track back through different versions and manuscripts, we find an ancient Aramaic version, and it gives us the following words. It tells us about Jesus. A, we find out Jesus existed, he was considered virtuous, Pilate condemned him to be crucified, and then after that, his disciples claimed 3 days later he rose from the dead. I've just sort of tried to highlight the key facts that jump out of that. So a couple of things which concord with our story. You've got Jesus as a virtuous teacher, condemned and crucified, and then afterwards his disciples claim that he was raised from the dead, which I guess we would agree with. Tacitus, so he wrote some 30 different volumes of history covering essentially the first century. Right? So he's writing a lot of material about that 100-year period. And he makes the following comments up on screen there in his section on Nero and the fire of Rome. And what that says is that, you know, there was a class of people called Christians. Christus was the name of their leader. He suffered the extreme penalty, that means crucifixion, at the hands of Pontius Pilate. Again, we've got the fella named. And then, despite the fact that he was crucified, the movement broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but it spread right through to Rome. So Tacitus tells us, there was Jesus, he was crucified, and after he was crucified, something happened that his disciples kept going with this story. Now that picture there, interestingly, is a picture of one of the only 2 manuscripts we have surviving of his work. That one dates from the year 1000. Right? The reason, so what? Well, we only have 2 surviving manuscripts. We've got that. Another one dates back to about the 5th century. So we have incredibly limited evidence. You compare that to the Gospels, where we've got over 5,100 different fragments of the Gospels, and we've even got just about complete Bibles that date to around 320, 340 AD. So much better evidence for the Scriptures than for some of these ancient historians, but that's just by the by. Pliny, another writer, he was a Roman official, governed an area which is now part of Turkey, just highlighted in green on the map so you get some sort of idea. Up by the Black Sea is where he was in charge. And he was writing seeking help from the emperor because he had these Christians that he were subversive and he needed to figure out how to deal with them. And again, it gives us some insight and evidence as to the existence of these Christians and the way which they operated, I guess the integrity that they demonstrated, particularly in their worship, and the fact that they were vowing not to commit fraud, adultery, falsify word, deny trust, all these sorts of things. And we actually find out he also tortured a couple of female deacons because he wanted to get more information. So again, we've just got evidence of the spread of these Christian believers and that they believed that Christ was alive. As in Pliny's words, he thinks they're referring to Christ as a god, but certainly someone who's alive, not dead. So we have independent sources, a variety of, not friendly, that demonstrate that Jesus was a historical person, that he was crucified, and then his disciples believed that he rose from the dead. And that's really the core of the Easter story. The next thing we've got is a missing body. So let's just talk about that for a minute or two. Before we do, out of interest, this is a 1st century tomb which is found just outside Jerusalem, and it was built for Queen of whatever that is, who died in AD 56. So a rich person just outside Jerusalem in the 1st century. Now you can see the various parts of this tomb. First of all, you can see that there's what they call a body decay slab. So they would wrap the body, place it on that bench, leave it there for a year. People would come into the tomb, they would say various prayers and things, anoint the body with spices to stop the smell overwhelming them. But the body would basically break down into bones. They'd then put the bones into a stone ossuary, a box, and then that box would be slid back. You can see there's a hole in the back of the tomb where they would store the stone ossuaries for later. So that then they've got the slab ready for the next person. So just a production line, in your family tomb. Yeah, lovely. But, when we talk about, the gospel records and how they ran in to the tomb to see where the body lay, it would have been laid out on a slab like that. So this design is quite a common design for tombs in the 1st century. So this is quite likely very similar in architecture, at least, to Joseph of Arimathea's tomb and what the disciples and the women would have run into to see where Jesus was laid. So I just thought that was interesting. I guess the question which has to be asked is, what is the most logical explanation for the missing body? If Jesus existed and Jesus was crucified, the disciples claimed through the Gospels and beyond that Jesus rose from the dead, that Jesus had bodily come back to life. Now, there's a number of explanations that are put forward that I would put firmly in the category of fiction, trying to explain the missing body. Right, so the first of those is that Jesus didn't actually die. There's a couple of variations. One is that it was not Jesus who was crucified, but someone who looked a bit like him. Seems unlikely given that Jesus was a well-known political figure and they interrogated him all night, so they knew they had the right person. Or that somehow he didn't die, like he got really sick, but he got better. Now, if we think about the logic of that, it's pretty poor. Jesus suffered significant torture prior to the crucifixion, and the Gospels record that he didn't actually carry the beam of the cross to the crucifixion site. This was unusual. Normally, the victim would have to carry the cross or the top beam to the cross to the crucifixion site, but the judgment of the soldiers was he wasn't physically capable of that. Hardly someone who was going to survive. Furthermore to that, the Roman soldiers made sure that people actually died, and we read that in the Gospel record. There is no evidence anywhere in history of someone surviving crucifixion. Never happened, and there were tens of thousands of people who were crucified over time. One instance, there was 3,000 in one go. Now, people could survive, it's true, for days. I think the record was close to 7, up on a cross. The Romans were quite good at keeping them alive and suffering, but no one ever got down alive. So you died up there. And I guess another just question of logic, when Jesus appeared to people, he was a healthy specimen, not a weak, recovering and shortly to die again individual. Another possible explanation that's put out sometimes by people who deny the resurrection is that the body was stolen. Now, there's a couple of things here which don't quite stand up. Firstly, the whole ethos of Christianity is one of truth. It just doesn't fit with the integrity of the entire religion. Secondly, the disciples were portrayed as being terribly confused, running away, disorganised, disbelieving. Hardly a group of people about to commit organised crime. And thirdly, we're told that there were guards on the tomb. So their ability to steal the body, very unlikely. Another suggestion that's put forward to explain the empty tomb is that there was some sort of group hallucination. So in this instance, people accept that the disciples genuinely believed Jesus was raised from the dead, but the explanation, because they're obviously wrong, is that they suffered some sort of hallucination all simultaneously. The problem with that is hallucinations are not experienced consistently from one individual to another. So even if a whole bunch of us here hallucinated, the way we would experience that hallucination would all be individual, so there wouldn't be a consistent story. In addition to that, Jesus appeared to individuals and large groups at different times and in different places, so the hallucination doesn't really work. And Jesus ate food with people. Again, there's a bodily experience, not a dreamlike ghost. And then you have later converts who initially were anti the whole story of Passover or Easter, like James, the Lord's brother, and Saul of Tarsus. So the hallucination explanation doesn't seem to be overly logical. The final alternative that's sometimes put forward is that the body was misplaced. So as Mary says to the gardener, look, if you've moved the body, let me know. And the suggestion is, well, maybe someone came officially and the body just ended up in the wrong tomb by mistake. Problem with that is, again, it's not consistent with the story that's there in the Gospels. The location, the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, is spelt out. And that's a consistent story that continues into some of the later non-canonical Gospel stories that are spread around. The Gospel of Peter is one instance. And those Gospels were written at a time when there was a great deal of angst with the Jewish leadership. So having a Jewish leader provide the tomb was not consistent with the direction of that feeling. So given the circumstances, Jesus was buried in a known location. Joseph was a well-known individual, which is why Pilate released the body to him. And again, the Jewish leaders put guards on the tomb. So the suggestion that the body could somehow be misplaced or the tomb be confused is very, very unlikely. And I guess the final piece around the missing body and all of those explanations really is they require a significant degree of dishonesty, of collusion about a story which is fundamentally untrue amongst the disciples. And of course, the reality of the circumstances that followed Jesus' resurrection is the disciples were persecuted. Right? And we read in early Acts, and we know from history, external history as well, that they were persecuted firstly by the Jewish leadership and then later on by Roman leadership around the entirety of the Roman Empire. All of these naturalistic explanations that deny that anything amazing happened require there to have been a conspiracy. The problem with that is, as one writer, Habermas, put it, liars make bad martyrs. And the reality is most of the 11, the key leaders in the early Christian church were not only persecuted, but many of them lost their lives. But not a single one of them ever recanted and sort of fessed up that actually it was all just a big trick, because I don't think it was. And that really leaves us with one final explanation, that Jesus was resurrected. We have to deal with the question of, you have someone who's a historical figure, you have someone who's actually killed, and then you have a whole raft of people saying they've been raised from the dead. What's the most likely explanation for that person, for that circumstance? And given the alternative explanations, personally, I think the best explanation is that the tomb was empty because Jesus was raised. And that has some pretty significant implications, obviously, for our lives. As we said, liars make incredibly bad martyrs. And the reality is that Christianity, facing not only persecution, but also a lot of antagonistic writers, and a couple are identified there, Celsius and Lucian in the late 2nd century. If any of the original leaders had recanted, it would have been spoken about and used to attack the Christian movement. But the reality is none of that did. None of that happened. And despite the fact that many of the 11 died at the hands of the authorities, none ever recanted, and all of these critics never got that propaganda opportunity. Everyone stuck to the facts that the tomb was empty because Jesus was raised. And that life-changing, unshakable certainty is the only explanation that they ever gave for really the rest of their lives. Let's talk about the eyewitnesses for a second. So the eyewitnesses that were presented are interesting. The first eyewitnesses to the resurrected Jesus are the women, right? And particularly Mary Magdalene. And that's what the Gospels present to us. Interestingly, if you go to 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul is giving evidence for the resurrection, he doesn't mention the women because they weren't considered culturally to be a reliable witness. But when the historical truth of the resurrection is being told, it's the women that first see Jesus, that he first reveals himself to. And then we've got, the next group of eyewitnesses were the scared and the sceptical disciples. So the 11 disciples don't believe the witnesses' report. We know that. The women, they thought they were crazy until Jesus actually appears to them. Then we have representation of eyewitnesses who didn't believe in Jesus. And again, this speaks to the reliability of the gospel records, that we have these unflattering portrayals of his disciples. Thomas, the two on the way to Emmaus, given up and were walking away. Unflattering portrayals, but they were eyewitnesses who turned around. Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 says that there were 500 people who were eyewitnesses to the resurrection. Now that's important because in the context of 1 Corinthians 15, he's arguing with people who don't accept the resurrection. Right? So again, he's facing a hostile crowd and he says, well, hang on a minute, you can go and ask these 500 people, they're still alive. Now, if you put out that sort of statement, it's fairly risky if that's not the case. Paul obviously believed there were 500 living eyewitnesses that he could use to get over this opposition. James is a hostile eyewitness. We know from the Gospels he wasn't on board with Jesus. Something changed him around. Right? So the question is what? When it wasn't the fact he was crucified, something happened after that to change James' mind. And then probably one of the star witnesses is Saul of Tarsus. So we see him depicted in Acts, he's a young man who's politically on the rise with the Jewish leadership, got a good career in front of him, throws it all in because he's convinced that Jesus is alive. There's something that happened that convinces him to change the course of his life, to go from on the rise, comfortable, good career path, to being an individual who's beaten up, shipwrecked, chased around the then known world by his opponents, and finally killed. There's something in the behaviour of these people. They were convinced something happened. This is perhaps a little fun, perhaps a little silly. I think it's interesting. Professor Dr. Grimes in 2016, he did a study on the life expectancy of a conspiracy theory, and there's a direct relationship between the number of people who are in the theory, in the conspiracy, and how long the conspiracy will last before it breaks open and everyone finds out that it's a fraud. Right? And he tested it, and there's a whole lot of these mathematical models behind it, which is all pretty good fun. The moon landing, if it was a conspiracy based on the number of people who were involved in it, would last for 3.8 years, which pretty close to climate change. I think that would be about 3.7 years, he calculated. Again, based on the number of people and the ability to hold a secret, and obviously the more people who know your secret, harder it is to keep. What I thought was interesting, and what I thought I'd just throw it up, is let's think about, okay, so is Easter a conspiracy? Did Jesus rise from the dead or not? If it's a conspiracy, the more people who know about it, the harder it is. How many knew? Well, initially, I guess you've got, the 11 and the women, but in Acts chapter 1, verse 15, you've got 120 people who are in the upper room. Right? A couple of days later, you've got 3,000 people baptised on one day. So you've actually got 3,000 plus the 120. Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 verse 6 says 500 eyewitnesses to the resurrection. How long can you keep the secret that actually this is just a big con job? Well, and again, it's just a bit of mathematical theory and fun, bit of experiment and stuff behind it, but you can't keep that sort of thing a secret when you have 500 eyewitnesses and then thousands of people joining in who are on the scene in Jerusalem and acquainted with the facts. The theory shouldn't have lasted 25 years. And of course, Dr. Grimes didn't build into his model the fact that people were tortured, which you would think would speed up the discovery of any conspiracy. Now, I just thought that was an interesting piece. Because the reality is these eyewitnesses then proceeded to, in the words of their own opponents, turn the world upside down. And this is, I guess, part of the evidence for, well, what happened at Easter? What really went on there? The reality is that those 11, those 500, those 3,000 people proceeded to take this religion out despite persecution from Jewish authorities, then from Roman authorities, without violence, without conquest, to spread a faith that went right throughout the Roman world. And what did they gain from it? Nothing. What was their motivation? The only possible explanation of their motivation is faith, that they saw Jesus raised from the dead. The leaders of the community didn't become powerful, they didn't become wealthy, they didn't actually gain from any of the sacrifice of putting their entire lives into teaching Jesus Christ crucified and raised. Conviction is the only reasonable answer. They gave everything because they believed what had happened to that first Easter. So Easter, despite the passion of New Age pagans and the ultra-conservative Christians, there's probably no reason for us to get overly uptight about Easter bunnies and hot cross buns. All of those things, we can enjoy without any spiritual regret whatsoever. There might be some physical consequences, but spiritually, not so much. But there is a lot more important things to consider with Easter. C.S. Lewis said, just quote, "Christianity, if false, is of no importance. If true, it is of infinite importance. The only thing it can't be is moderately important." Make sense? If Christianity is true, it is of infinite importance. Jesus unquestionably existed. He was unquestionably crucified. They're the bald facts of history. That is agreed by friend and foe. The only question, and the only important question, is what happened next. Did Jesus rise from the dead? If he did, Christianity is of infinite importance. And I think that's the most likely explanation. It agrees to the historical facts, it agrees to the eyewitness accounts. It's the only thing that explains their subsequent actions and devotion. The naturalistic explanations are inherently unlikely and fly in the face of the facts, in the face of logic, and require a blatantly unsustainable conspiracy despite torture and execution. The resurrection of Jesus, as remembered and celebrated at Easter, is the most important fact in the world, and one that has profound implications for all of us all the time.